Why do they keep giving new people the superhero mantles or changing them when they make the movies? Why can't they just make new characters if they want diversity? Alright. Let's talk about that. Hey everybody! Time for a nice little LGBTQ plus sort of area ramble. We'll see how this goes. I have notes, but I didn't script this one. So yeah, the question that I've seen pop up more than a few times when things get announced that appear to be changing a formerly, usually, straight, white, cis, male character into something that diverges from any of those four tends to get a not great response. We've seen that plenty. And I don't want to deal with all of the arguments that tend to come up. There is one specific one that this video is going to address. And that is this argument of why don't they, if this is being done for inclusion and representation, why are you changing the existing characters? Why don't you just make new ones? And the reason I want to address that is because in a vacuum, that's valid. I mean, honestly, if you want to expand the diversity of a cast, it makes sense just to create new characters rather than rewrite the ones you've already got. I mean, there's no reason not to in a vacuum. On paper. But I'm going to be talking about superheroes and adaptations from superheroes and pretty much focusing on the big two, Marvel and DC, because I'm not going to say this is the only place these arguments come up, but they're certainly where they come up the most frequently these days because superheroes are really big movie and TV business right now. So this is the framing through which I want to tackle it. And first of all, let's acknowledge exactly how prevalent is this? Well, it's been going on for a little while. Some examples from films that we already have would include Tessa Thompson and Idris Elba as Valkyrie and Heimdall in the Thor films. We've got Lawrence Fishburne playing Perry White in the DC films. Michael B. Jordan was Johnny Storm in that one terrible Fantastic Four movie. We had Zendaya as MJ and Jacob Batalon, sorry if I mispronounced that, as Ned Leeds in both Spider-Man films and presumably in the next one when that happens. And as far as upcoming, Eternals is like going to be a massive indicator, or not indicator, but continuation of this sort of trend because you've got Salma Hayek playing Ajak, Lauren Ridloff playing Makari, and in addition to the very obvious changes, she's also deaf, which the original character was not, and she was going to be portraying the character as deaf. You've got Don Lee as Gilgamesh, Leah McHugh as Sprite, and also, very recently, at the time of recording, Zoe Kravitz got confirmed as Catwoman. So, yeah, no, this totally happens. So, the thing I will immediately acknowledge, this isn't a one-off or an outlier when these things happen. The ones I mentioned is not even comprehensive by any means. This sort of thing is going on a fair amount. When these characters are getting adapted, that changes are happening. That the casting is more diverse than the characters are on the page. Now, of course, when people say the whole, why don't you just make an original character? They don't mean like for the movie. They mean, why don't you create an original superhero and then make a movie about that superhero? Or at least I think that's what they mean. Because if they're saying create a completely original superhero character not based on a comic, like that's not the trend. Like what was the last completely original superhero you ever heard of? Like created for film? I don't know. Meteor Man? Like that's not a thing. Like it happens like at all. So here's what I'm going to do to sort of explain, because I know where I'm going with this. But I'm going to explain a couple things, and we're going to compare a couple of decades. Actually, more than a couple. We're going to compare 4 decades worth of mainstream superhero comic book writing and what kind of new characters got introduced in what volumes. And so we're going to be talking 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. And there is a point to this. This is context, and I'll come back around to it at the end. So stick with me. So now keep in mind, I'm not doing a super deep dive on these. And I'm going to throw out some numbers, but they're by no means comprehensive, and I'm sure I certainly missed people. But this was the base level research I did, and it shows the trend. And so if I missed one or two, I don't think that severely breaks the date in terms of the points that I'm trying to make here. So, in the 80s, you had over 30 new, notable superhero characters introduced. Now, this is going to come up in all the other ones too. This includes ones who have stuck around and we still know today, as well as ones that... I'm sorry, who is that? So, over at Marvel, you had characters like Kitty Pryde, Dazzler, She-Hulk, Elektra, Rogue, all introduced in the 80s. As well as characters like Firestar, Arachne, and Excalibur. Some of these are going to be teams. DC introduced characters like Raven, Cyborg, Starfire, Jason Todd, and Tim Drake, 1 through 2 Robins, Lobo, Booster Gold, and then also Maxima, Vixen, and Omega. Now, in the 80s, both Marvel and DC were cranking out new characters at a similar rate. They were pretty close to each other. Things started to diverge a little bit after that, though. In the 90s, Marvel introduced way more new characters than DC did. DC spent the 90s really going all in on events with their existing characters, because the 90s was things like Death of Superman, Nightfall, whatever the Green Lantern thing was it Emerald Dawn? I can't even remember. Whatever it was called when Hal Jordan went nuts. So they were doing lots of big events based around their existing characters and not introducing a ton of new ones at that point. Marvel was still introducing new ones, though not as many as they were in the 80s. At least not as many that you would consider notable, especially if you're lumping teams as, if you're counting teams as one as opposed to all the individuals. Because let's be honest, X-Force you've heard of. Each individual member of X-Force, not so much. Strong Guy, Boom Boom, Cannonball. But anyway, some examples. Marvel gave us characters like Cable, Gambit, Deadpool, Bishop, War Machine, and, also Darkhawk, X-Man, Generation X. And over at DC, Jesse Quick, Static, and the Jack Knight version of Starman. So, not too much going on over there. The 2000s saw things tick up again with both, though Marvel was still doing significantly more than DC was. So Marvel was introducing characters like X-23, Bob, Agent of Hydra, Miles Morales, and then, a bunch of people like Black Fox, Buzz, Typeface, Spike, Freak Show. I don't know who these people are, but their names I found. And over at DC, the ones that are important and have stuck around would be Miss Martian, the Jaime Reyes version of Blue Beetle, and then there's the also-rans like King Chimera, Forerunner, Night Eagle, Orpheus. And in the 2010s, almost no new characters were introduced at either one. Marvel still did a couple more than DC, but neither of them did very many. Marvel gave us Kamala Khan, Spider-Gwen, Gwenpool. DC gave us Batwing. And if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed in the 2000s and the 2010s, if you paid attention to the names of characters that have stuck around, you may have noticed something. They're all derivative of existing characters. Basically, there hasn't really been a truly new character introduced, superhero character introduced at either Marvel or DC in the last 20 years that has made significant impact. The closest I'd say you could come would be maybe Kamala Khan, because she bears the least resemblance to the character that whose mantle she takes, that being Ms. Marvel, but she is still taking another character's mantle. She's got a completely different power set, completely different origins, completely different operating procedure and MO and everything else, but they still had to slap the name on it to get it to take off. New characters don't get traction in superhero comics. Not anymore. This is part of why DC keeps rebooting every 5 years. And that's why DC had virtually nothing in the 2010s. Because 2011 gave us the New 52. They weren't going to introduce new characters. They were resetting all the ones they already had. I mean, and even the one that I caught, Batwing, it's just one more Bat family member. There were a ton of them. And then they did Rebirth and Reset the Reset. The things that sell comics are the characters that have already been around. New characters will get introduced in supporting roles as, backup side characters, friends, romantic interests maybe. But the actual heroes, the people who we're here to see, new characters just don't make it. I mean, they don't. The new characters that have made a notable impact since 2000, nearly 20 years, X-23, literally a gender-flipped clone of Wolverine. Miles Morales, Spider-Man with a different origin and different racial background. Miss Martian, female but derivative of Martian Manhunter. Jaime Reyes, he's the third person to be the Blue Beetle. Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, I mentioned. Spider-Gwen, it's Gwen Stacy, but she's basically Spider-Man. Gwenpool, again, it's Gwen Stacy, but now Deadpool. About the only one that I could say, maybe you could say isn't derivative would be Bob, Agent of Hydra. But let's be honest, Bob, while I would love him to show up as a supporting character in whatever they do with Deadpool next, he's not going to get his own film. The point is, when people make the argument, specifically in regards to comic book movies, when they see the casting announcements for something like The Eternals or Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman, and they say, why can't you leave the white male cis straight characters alone? Why can't you just add diversity with new characters? Because it's not viable. That argument works, as I said at the start, in a vacuum. In a vacuum, you can say there's no reason to change the characters, just introduce new ones. And if the characters are good, they'll become popular enough where they get to be their own thing. But new characters don't become a thing. They just don't. They haven't for a long time. Not unless they can piggyback on someone else. And the ones that I mentioned, the ones that are all clearly derivative of existing characters, surprise, surprise, get this same thing thrown at them. Why are you giving us a female version of Wolverine? We have Wolverine. Do something else. Do an original character. Why do we have Miles Morales? We already have a Spider-Man. You're just doing this for inclusion. Make an original character. When original characters get made, if they get made, they don't make an impact. The only way to get in there is through the established characters. Whether that means someone new taking on a mantle, or whether that means changing in adaptation. And I would continue to argue that more often than not, these changes are not just being done to please minorities. I mean, minorities by their definition don't have the most box office swing. They're a minority of the market. But in general, regardless of the reason, even if it is for inclusion, even if the reason that this is being done is strictly to diversify the cast and to be more inclusive, making the argument that this shouldn't be done and instead new characters should be introduced is kneecapping the ability to ever get more diverse representation, either in the comics and therefore by association in the films. Now, I suspect most people making this argument don't realize that or haven't thought about it enough to come to that conclusion. Some of them might have, and some of them might realize that they're making an argument that basically says, oh, don't do this thing. Instead, I'm going to assist you go off and do this other thing that I know won't work. There are probably some, but I suspect a fair number of people who make this argument don't realize that it basically just becomes a reason why diversifying these casts, these characters, would just never happen. So this is going to become another one of those instances where when I see people making that argument, why don't you just create a new character? I'm just going to start linking to this video instead of replying to comments. What are your thoughts on this? On new characters being introduced into comics? About the changes that are made in adaptation or when new characters take on mantles?